Welcome back to the channel. Last time we got this first row staked to the ground, and today we are going to absolutely crank this thing out. So let's get right into it. As you can see in the one section where we do have overlap between the timbers, we are going to be attaching these together using some lag bolts. These are 10-inch long structural strength screws. They are ridiculously hard and they go through almost the entirety of 2 layers at a time, but more on that in a minute. As I mentioned in a prior episode, I'm going to be cutting all joints with a miter saw, but my miter saw does not reach the entire way through these 6-inch timbers. So basically I've got to cut as far as I can on one side, then flip the thing over, try to match the angle and line up as best as I can by eye, and then finish off the cut from the far side. Before everything's fastened in place, those cut ends will have to be resealed with stain. The treatment that prevents the boards from rotting is only on the outside surface, so when you cut to the inside of it, that face is now untreated. So basically that'll just help prolong the life of this and prevent it from rotting out. That said, the overarching process for what I'm doing here is roughly laying out the layer on each wall, taking the measurements while the block is actually on the wall, that way I get a real measurement and not just an estimate that will somehow be an inch off every time, and then going through and screwing all these together with those 10-inch lag screws. And what you might notice specifically on the first few that I was attempting was that I was having a whole lot of difficulty getting these things to go in. First of all, the diameter of these screws is pretty large. It has to physically displace a large amount of wood just to go into these timbers. And second of all, being a 10-inch length, that is the longest version of the screw that I found locally available. And while that goes really far into the row below it, it'll make this thing a lot more structurally stable and give it a lot more support. The trade-off is, just like with the width of this, the entirety of that depth is wood that you have to displace as you screw this thing in. And these timbers specifically are not exactly a soft wood, making drilling through this very hard to begin with, but especially hard when you're going through almost the entirety of 2 rows at once. I have an 18-volt impact gun. I tried using that at first. That actually was not enough to get the screw all the way seated, and I thought that maybe it would have had lower power than something that was corded, seeing as it was battery operated. So I also tried that hammer drill that I initially bought to stake all these timbers to the ground. The hammer drill also didn't seem to make a whole lot of progress. Now on a later screw, I actually reversed the order. I did the hammer drill first and then the impact gun, and that proved to me that the impact gun actually had more power than the hammer drill. But between the amount of force that it takes to drive these things in, as well as the extremely hot heat and high humidity, the batteries were getting drained or overheated very quickly. And while this wasn't necessarily a problem on a fresh battery, even after the point of doing 4 or 5 screws, there was a noticeable drop in performance for how far the impact gun would actually get these things into the timbers. I soon discovered that the last couple inches on every single screw are something that I was going to have to do by hand. And remember that bit where I said it was going to take a lot of force? I had to use a 2-foot breaker bar to do those last couple turns. I'm not necessarily a small guy, so for me to need a 2-foot bar and to put so much force that in some cases I was visibly deflecting that bar, that should give you some idea of just how difficult these things were to drive through these timbers. And my immediate concern was that was going to add a lot more physical labor and also strain on my wrists and arms than I probably initially accounted for. I also discovered the head of those lag screws stuck up just enough to throw off the balance of the row above. Despite sticking out less than a 1/4 inch, it was still enough to make the entire timber rock back and forth like a seesaw, which means not only did I have to drive these things through 2 layers, I actually had to sink that top head below the top surface of that top timber. I tried to do that with brute force and just pure turning power on the first couple. I very quickly discovered that that was absolutely not sustainable, and what I ended up doing is finding the biggest punch in my garage, and I actually just used my hammer with that punch, made a big old dent in that top surface, and then put the screw through that dent. My largest punch was actually the perfect size to act as a countersink for those screw heads, and it gave them just enough depth that it was no longer interfering with the next higher row. Other than that though, everything was pretty straightforward. I squared off all the faces using the edge of a speed square. I checked the level continuously as I went along, and at the corners where 2 faces meet, you just want to stagger which side overlaps, as well as staggering the center point of your rows, but all this stuff is pretty much common sense. I was typically using 2 to 3 screws per section of timber. Now 2 2 is the minimum, but adding a third, first of all, is just more physical effort, especially having to turn this thing by hand, but also these screws are about $1 each. So over the course of the entire wall, that could add another $100 or so depending on how many extra you use. For me, I was typically adding a third only at places where there was an interface. That way the area around the interface was more supported and it wouldn't shift as much, and that way it would stay in alignment long term. These screws are so strong anyhow that you don't need 3 in most areas. It was probably a bit of overkill, and not having perfect alignment might actually give the wall more character depending on the aesthetic you're looking for, but having that good corner alignment was important for me and worth the extra cost and effort. But there you go, that's basically all you have to do until you get to roughly row 3, and that is where you get to bury some dead men. If you, like me at the start of this project, know nothing about retaining walls, you're probably asking what a dead man is. Well, basically, you're gonna make a big old T using some of these timbers. That T is gonna go into the ground behind the retaining wall. It is going to get buried much like the regular dead men that we're all used to, and it'll anchor the retaining wall into the ground and support it better structurally. Basically, you're using the dirt's weight against itself to anchor it in farther back, and that way, if something goes to push out the wall, it also has to push against the entire weight of the dirt supporting that anchor. And for most building codes, these have to start at about the 3rd row, and they have to go every other row after that. Unfortunately, because this is going into the ground behind the retaining wall, it also means that we have to do more digging. And not only that, you also have to make sure the place you dig out is both level and in line with the rest of the wall. Otherwise, if the dirt compacts more, this thing settles over time, or even if it's just not straight to begin with, the twist is going to pull through that timber into the face. At the very least, the face of the board for the dead man is obviously not going to line up perfectly, but worst case, it could actually grab and start to twist your entire wall or distort it just a little bit. And that is another one of those bad things that we are trying to avoid. Because these are structurally important, I actually used 4 screws total to make this. I put 2 on the T end that's going to be buried, and the other 2 just in that small area that's going to be anchoring into the wall. And then in the next row as well, I'm going to do a 3rd screw that's going to go straight through into the top of that T. Again, just integrating it better with the full wall structure, because this is a pretty critical part. Now, if you'd like, you also have the option of playing a game of Jesus and staking the ends of those T's on the dead men into the ground below it, just like you do on the first layer of the retaining wall to stake that into the ground. And I did do that, but not until this tier was almost entirely completed. But the only problem I really ran into when doing these dead men was once again running into the rock ledge. Specifically, as I got farther uphill on my property towards that one section of the old retaining wall that's made of cinder blocks, the rock ledge is more and more prominent in that region, and I did have to trim down a few of these dead men just to fit in between the gaps of the rocks. Not exactly an ideal scenario, but we are definitely overbuilding this compared to what we probably need. But otherwise, it is just straight up hammer time, and I am hammering this thing out to the best of my ability. This was another consecutive summer with a record-setting rainfall. That drove me to chip away at this every single chance I got, even if it was only for an hour or 2 here and there. I set the goal for myself to finish a row or at least a solid section every single night after work. I'd pretty much get home from work, immediately change, work on this for an hour or 2 while it was still somewhat light out, and honestly, I was pretty hard on myself about making sure I met that target. However, I think that is the only reason I was actually able to get this done and that I made as much progress as I did. So if you're ever thinking about doing a project of this magnitude on your own, if you do not have that level of drive, don't start it. Just don't do it, pay someone else to do it, or this will take you literally years. Even throwing all the spare time I could at this, every night, every weekend that it wasn't raining, it still probably took me a couple weeks of overall time to get this section done, even though stacking the blocks was the fast part of this entire process. But somehow, unbelievably, 4 years into this project, I finally finished the first tier of this retaining wall. Now, obviously, I still have to backfill this. I still have to put in the gravel for the drainage. I mean, hell, it's not even stained at this point, and I still gotta do that. But the fact that these blocks are even together and fastened and secured to the ground, oh my god, this is a milestone I was in disbelief that I actually hit. This was a perfect time to just bask in all the glory of the progress we've made, because honestly, this is monumental. But that'll do it for this episode, and I'll see you guys next time when we are finally getting to the finishing portions of this first tier. Thank you for watching.